Pandemic has left many elderly people isolated, and the most recent Hurricane Ida also impacted them as well. Medical experts say the isolation can have negative neurological impacts on the elderly. With more on those impacts is Dr. Chad Domeng. Good afternoon, Dr. Domeng.
Hey, good to see you guys. Thanks for having me. Excited to share what's on my brain.
Oh, wow. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what impacts you've noticed. And I know you even noticed them in your mom, that elderly people kind of had to go through during the pandemic, and then, Hurricane Ida. It's just been one hit after another.
Yeah, it's a tough group that's dealing with a lot. I mean, we're all having to deal with all the impacts of these things, but obviously the elderly is at the most risk. What we're talking about specifically, Meg, is what's called social isolation. This is a medical phenomenon. So what happens to our brain is we are social creatures. So we have several parts of our brain that are specifically dedicated to the social interactions. So we have what's called a dorsomedial frontal cortex. That allows us to know what we feel about ourselves, empathy, a sense of self-being. We have a right parietal temporal, which allows us to interpret other people's emotions. And we have a portion on the inside called the amygdala that allows us to process fear and the facial expressions of people and emotions. When you look at the elderly, they're at the highest risk because they can have bad mental processing already as dementia or age-related changes, poor hearing, poor vision, and 28% of our elderly are living in isolation, whether it be nursing homes, living alone. So they're at such a high risk to this social isolation, and then you add a pandemic, a hurricane, and you can see how this can be really deadly to our brains.
Is there any way to kind of reverse that damage or to, prevent especially the elderly from going through something like this?
The first thing is we need to understand this is a real medical problem. And we're so reactive to make these legislative changes to these groups of people living in nursing homes and living in this isolation. The first question is really simple. Is the cure worse than the disease? So what I mean by that, and I dealt with this with my mother last year, I took her out to nursing home. Before we lock people up, and I certainly understand why we did so, are we doing irreparable damage to their brains, depression, suicide? Are we doing things that far outweigh the benefits of the isolation from the virus? And again, these are very, very difficult questions. But the first step is to identify our actions have a medical, neurological consequence. And this is not just social. We can put people in a nursing home, forget about it, and there's no big deal. It's a very big deal. And a lot of these things cannot be repaired.
But, a lot of people, they maybe don't have the resources that you have to pull their loved one out of a nursing home, for example. But what should those folks do? How do you stimulate the brain without being able to take them out?
Yeah, and that's difficult. And I have 2 young children. It's very simple when you're dealing with these elderly. A routine is so important, right? You don't want the ups and downs. You want to set sleep time. And this effect can have irreparable damage on multiple organ systems. They can have stress, increases catecholamines, heart issues, immune issues, endocrine issues. So it's important that you constantly engage with a loved one. It's important that you look to see if there's signs that the isolation is making them worse. But what you said is exactly right. I'm very blessed. I have a lot of resources. I was able to take my mother out. What I would like to see from our government is what are the options for those that don't have those resources? Maybe one nursing home for people that want to take their chances, one nursing home for people that want to be locked down, or other types of resources that allow these people to make a decision for themselves. These people were locked up against their will. They don't have the option of coming live with their son who has a spare bedroom. A lot of these people have dementia or other high-level medical needs that a lot of our families and our communities just can't deal with. So it's a very difficult problem.
And again, it's not just the elderly who are suffering from this. I mean, as I mentioned, you've got the pandemic and Hurricane Ida. So a lot of people, even if you're living alone, you're isolated and you may be suffering the effects.
Yeah, I mentioned this in another news story when it came to the children not going to school. And we just throw these Zoom conversations as if it's no big deal. Again, we are a social creature. We have a neurological system that has circuitry that's meant for us to hug, to kiss, to touch. And when you take all those things away, which again, I'm not getting into the conversation whether that was right or wrong, there is a consequence to those actions. And I just don't think we've seen enough of a news front from doctors discussing the damages that are being done on our elderly, our middle class, and our children. It's affecting everybody, and there's going to be long-term effects to the brain that we're not going to be able to change.
Well, we'll be finding out the effects of that for years to come, certainly. Dr. Domingue, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it.
All right, thanks for having me. Good to see you guys.